Welcome to this session on redefining experimentation in the Global South. My name is Matias Ramirez. I'm a senior lecturer at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and we've organised this session to reflect part of the experiences of the work that we're undertaking in Latin America with transformative innovation policy. In May 2020, we formed a Latin America hub to which 8 institutions from Colombia, Chile, and Mexico became members. And since then, we've been conducting experiments and undertaking a whole series of initiatives to really try to develop this way of this new form of undertaking innovation policy within the region. And what we want to do is to reflect with you some of these experiences with both experiments that we've been taking, that have been undertaken, and also through the reflections of some panelists who are going to talk to you about their experiences as well. All of the people here have experience of working in Latin America, except of course for our own Bipashi, who is overlooking, has great experience within TIPC, and I think it's important. She has experience in the context of Europe and Africa, and she can also provide some excellent reflections as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you the names of all the people who are participating here. They can introduce themselves in a little bit more detail afterwards, and then I'm just going to say a few words to get the session going. So we have a fantastic panel here of people who have first-hand experience. First of all, Claudia Obando. She works as a research fellow in SPRU in the University of Sussex, and her experience is particularly of monitoring and evaluation of the TIPC experiments in the Latin America hub. Ana Osorio works in El Valle del Cauca, which is in Colombia, and she's going to be one of the experimenters. Carmen Bueno is from the University Iberoamericano of Mexico, and she's also going to be one of the experimenters. I've already mentioned Bipashi, who works at the Science Policy Research Unit and is one of the lead researchers in TIPC. Juan Pablo Isaza is a policymaker, a regional policymaker in the coffee axis within Colombia, which brings together 4 regions which are heavily coffee producers. And he's going to be talking about that experience and how TIPC could be relevant. Alyssa Arond works in the Stockholm Environment Institute in the Bogota office. She's been working there for a while, but we have undertaken a lot of collaborations before. And finally, Pablo Sepúlveda is one of the experimenters who is from the University of Talca in Chile, who is also going to be talking about his experience of the experiments within that particular region. So that's that. Now let me just say a few words about what motivated this session and how we think we need to start perhaps thinking about this question, rethinking a little bit about this question of experimentation in the Global South. So experimentation as a policymaking tool has definitely moved into the mainstream as local actor networks have emerged around alternative socio-technical systems. So we think of something like cycling or walking in the area of mobility. If we think of organic and perma-agriculture in the area of food production, if we think of fair trade coffee, if we think of waste recycling in the area of urban areas, then you can see everywhere that people are trying to experiment with alternatives to these sort of big systems. Now, some of these underlying some of these experiments are, I think, longer term visions based on anticipatory thinking. So what you basically got is a fusion between solutions to day-to-day problems and the attempt to form new systems. And that, in a way, is what characterizes a transformative view, linking day-to-day efforts with attempting to re-establish new systems. Now, what we want to do in this session is to draw attention to this notion of experimentation as a new transformative policy for the Global South, and just open that discussion a little bit. Most used definitions of experimentation, for example, the work of Sanders, 2016, assume that experimentation as a form of public policy takes place in a formal regulated environment. Therefore, it's possible to produce demonstrators whose outcomes can generally be anticipated through some form of replication. So anticipation can then be backed up by niche experimentation. And you've got lots of examples such as urban labs and so on. And this is a fusion between experimentation and imaginaries. And through that, new pathways can emerge. So I want to raise two issues associated to that particular narrative, which is mainly a narrative which comes from the global north, and whether this is really a useful theory of change for an age of sustainability. The first one, and I'm going to draw a little bit upon this Brazilian-born author surname Unger, is that in undertaking these transitions, you have to confront certain incumbents who normally have a lot of power, and power is a complex question, and therefore the resistance to that has to also reflect that complexity. So he supports, Unger, this idea of a step-by-step approach to creating alternative institutional configurations. And the key thing is that they are learning. So you can think about all the experiments to support social entrepreneurship, ecological restoration, participative learning. These are all ways in which we should support this step-by-step approach to support learning, but at the same time, try to cut certain roads off, such as, for instance, debt-driven development, authoritarian control, and so on. And through this almost incremental step, it can lead to radical reform, okay? So new mode, because it can lead to new modes of social organization and, of course, innovation. But there is an alternative view, which is of this concept of experimentation. And here, if you look at the work of May and Perry in particular, for them, they criticize a lot the idea of experimentalism and its fusion with futures thinking, because what it can do at times is it can pit the fight for distributional justice today and reconfigurations today against a kind of imaginary where somehow through some sort of process of consensus, power differentials will be dissolved discursively, which is sort of pie in the sky idea. So the politics, the sort of experimental process can shift aside the politics of today, which is suspended. And this can be a delusion because the future is often written by the visions of the quite powerful. So, where are we? I'm presenting two views, if you like, of experimentation. Where are we? I think on the one hand, perhaps we need to avoid just focusing today on structures. So experiments are important, but at the same time, those experiments can't just be tinkering with the systems that occur, which is often what we fall into when the funding system is just based on projectification, one project after another, which projects which are not linked, projects which don't have a sort of system change narrative. And I think in that sense, what we try to do in TIPSY is to think about these activities, these projects, which involve building larger and larger networks that actually embody and express this imaginary. So I think that's, and we need actions now to do that. So I think that's one interesting issue that might be worth reflecting upon. I think the other is what exactly does experimentation and futures represent in the global south? What does it mean? What does an imaginary mean in the global south? Because the fact is that the imaginary in millions of people is actually to secure something today, a foothold, to gain a foothold for survival within a formal informal spectrum. And in the global south, we've got these unregulated or less coherent systems, which are often the norm. What this means is that ambiguity and uncertainty make it difficult to anticipate. Remember, this question of anticipation was so important in contrast to most global north countries, where infrastructures are coordinated or are owned by large monopolies with a professionally run bureaucracy. Therefore, a conception of experimentation is required that reflects these unstable relational settings in which services are provided in the context of very rapidly changing, informal, unstable, and often unregulated or semi-regulated dynamics. And that's probably one of the challenges that we have, where often the solutions are sort of hybrids and that reflect diverse needs. And, you know, especially perhaps in an urban context, that's going to become a defining feature. I say urban because you've got lots of population movements, immigration, and so on. And that's going to be a defining feature of innovation and delivery of services. These need to be situated in practices based on testing, constant refinements to achieve common understanding around some sort of expected outcome. Now, finally, this poses issues for the state and for policy, because obviously it means working with a very de-hierarchical state in partnership with these sections of civil society, private sectors, etc., which is not something commonly that you do find within the global south policymaking. So that's what I wanted to say. That's the sort of scene setting that I wanted to establish in terms of rethinking the concepts of experimentation. And I think that, you know, that's one of the responsibilities for us. That's one of the responsibilities for our TIPC colleagues working in Africa, and of course in the audience, those trying to undertake experimentation in the global south in different settings. So I will now pass over to our experimenters. I'll just explain the way we're going to do the session. We're going to hear three cases of experiments which the Latin America hub is taking place. These are going to be a mixture. They're all going to be videos and PowerPoints and pre-recorded and live audios. So there's going to be three, as I said, one from Chile, one from Mexico, and one from Colombia. After that, then, I'm going to ask the three panelists that we have, just for about 10 minutes each, just to give their thoughts on some of the issues that are emerging within the debate, and also from their own experience, and that will be very interesting. And then after that, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to take some questions or comments, which anybody from the speakers can come in on. And then Claudia at the end will come in and give a little sort of summary of the discussion so far. So I hope that's clear to everyone. Okay, so I'll pass on to Claudia now, who's going to coordinate the presentations of the three cases. Claudia.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Annie, I think we can get started with Talca's video.
Institute for Innovation, part of the University of Cal. Our experiment, which is called Healing Water, takes place in Chile, specifically in the central southern part of the country, which has a strong agricultural vocation. Our objective is to promote the formation of a learning network between public, private, and civil society actors to support sustainable and inclusive practices in the use of water for agricultural production. We were asked how the definitions of experimentation offered by transition literature applies to the southern context and our experiment. We believe that in general, these definitions apply well to the Latin American context, which is the one with which we are most familiar. However, the caveat is that these definitions tend to assume that there is a kind of orchestra conductor capable of providing institutional support to address the challenges that are taken on. This will exclude what we believe occurs in practice in Latin America and what we have seen in our experiment, which in our view also deserves to be recognized as experimentation. To give you some context about our experiment, we have found alternative practices for sustainable water use, which include syntropic agriculture, agroforestry, agroecology techniques, the Fukuoka method, and many others. These practices have in common that they propose a biocentric paradigm and take into account natural constraints, which contrasts with the predominant large-scale expansive agriculture for export, with its high consumption of natural resources and focus on profitability over sustainability. This second kind of agriculture is dominant, of course. This context has influenced our understanding of transformative outcomes. For example, in terms of shielding, there is a need to test and legitimize alternative practices. These practices need to demonstrate that they can become a sustainable and viable business model. With respect to learning, it might be relevant to broaden the knowledge base, integrating new methodologies that strengthen practices. For example, integrating other views such as smart agriculture. Finally, with regard to the alignment of expectations, it is essential to bring together actors with political capacity within the system who can provide ambitious and long-term visions. So what have we learned so far? In a context of scarce resources, it is more difficult to venture into experimentation. However, being able to innovate even with strong restrictions can also be considered a strength of such systems, and therefore also an opportunity. That is exactly what we found, small groups and communities experimenting. On the other hand, when processes are less institutionalized, it is much more difficult to find the right people because they used to be very isolated. You have to spend more time finding actors who are experimenting or at least interested in experimenting. Finally, we have seen that the transformation space is less inclusive at the beginning because there is less diversity of actors. It is a challenge to open up the spaces and make them more inclusive, but it is not so obvious what is the right time to do that. Finally, some implications for policy. First, as the changes are especially slow in this context and occur in some sort of bricolage between actors with different interests that do not necessarily converge, policy must play an articulating role in these spaces and contribute to the transformation. Even though it might not have all the resources and capabilities, it can identify and connect the leading actors. Also, there is another complexity in designing, measuring, monitoring, and evaluating the progress of the transformation. So there is a need to design new instruments to go beyond a focus on projects, moving towards the ability to measure the impact of the whole transformation. Thank you very much.
Do I start? Okay, so I'm Carmen Bueno. I'm representing the Ibero team in this presentation. The experiment, and I would so please next. And Awitsuki Center online production. It started 3 years ago in an indigenous region in the southern part of the country. After India, Mexico and China are the most important producers of lime in the world. Many communities of the region have lime gardens that until recently produce low quality products and sell them to intermediaries. Next, please. What are the immediate activities that can give directionality to the experiment in order to achieve a real transformation? The first thing was to change the agricultural practices so that the farmers could start producing organic lime that has more value in the local as well as the global market, and most important, help to regenerate the land. Before, they were using subsidized chemical products that were devastating the quality of the soil. The second thing was to develop a cooperative that, besides agricultural activities, could allow them to control the processing and packing of lime. The third was a need to develop technical capacities without overlooking local values and norms. On the contrary, decision-making since the beginning is collectively governed, motivating social cohesion and a close identity with the project. Next, please. What are the strengths? Contrary to the Global North experiments, regulations are based on informal practices, culturally legitimized over time, known as usos y costumbres. The strength of this is that it legitimizes collective decision-making, reinforces commitments, long-term reciprocity, and trust. Trust is very important. It's based on long-term, even transgenerational reputation. About challenges, the recent relations with outsiders, that is with stakeholders, that are willing to participate in a social investment presented some tensions because of the unalignment between local practices and formal norms and regulations. Stakeholders even hire law firms to design a legal figure for the co-investment with producers and a specific tax treatment at their convenience. One of the recent tensions was on land tenure regulations, where the packing station is being built. Stakeholders wanted agrarian auditing instead of the implementation of usos y costumbres. For this specific topic, one of the founding producers was a cultural translator that helped in the negotiations with the local landowners. Values such as individualism and productivism are confronted always. Next, please. Last year, we centered all our efforts analyzing shielding as the most important outcome of this stage of the experiment. We made a critical and permanent analysis of the role played by our university as a strategic intermediary in a multi-actor operative plan. The university as an intermediary does not have any business interest. Instead, it has been settled in indigenous regions for decades as part of a Jesuit social programs. No? This region is considered a cradle of the liberation theology. The specificities that we have learned from this experiment is that there is a need for a long-lasting, committed intermediary that connects the project's ideas of change of a region that lacks social and cultural Western capital with social actors at the regime level that can provide different types of support that are very important for the experiment to start. The most important challenge of the intermediary is enhanced from this stage second-order learning in the local procedures to stimulate agency so that they develop capacities to negotiate with the regime actors, norms, and practices. Next, please. Summarizing what we have learned as members of the Hub, solutions given to tensions, confrontations, and couplings have to be documented in order to codify tacit knowledge for future projects in the Global South, generate mechanisms that can match interests and agendas. Next and last, please. What are the implications for policy in the redefinition of experiments? Centering our analysis in the implications of policy, we find that there is a lack of policy incentives to nurture grassroots projects. Also, there is an erratic presence of public policy. Specifically, at the regime level, we do find a very complex regulatory apparatus, although mechanisms to go to terrain to be implemented are weak, unpredictable, and of course, distance to indigenous practice. Rules, in fact, are tailored at the convenience of vested interest at the regime level. And at the niche level, these communities do not feel their needs are really attended, and regulations are seen as control and imposition. Thank you.
We hear the Anna, can you put the sound on this? I think the volume may be where our pictures are, so. Anna, can we hear you, please? Can you just say something?
Hello. Yes, I can. I can do it if you want. Just give me a second.
Anna, why don't you just talk over it? But we need to see the slides.
Do you want me to share it?
Go on then, yes.
Okay.
Just let her do it. We're just waiting for Anna to put her slides up for the final presentation. Anna, how are you getting on? Anna?
Yes, just give me a second. I'm trying to share this.
All right.
Good afternoon, I'm Ana Osorio and I work in this project called Un Bache del Conocimiento. Well, to answer this first question, how this definition applied to certain context and or experiment? Well, in our case, this applies in the sense that the experiment and the learning happen under condition of uncertainty and ambiguity, and is due to conventional methods don't necessarily approach communities and people. Barely even trying to do, the experiments are not inclusive because of power relations found in the field. Generally, professionals, and I include myself, work on a priori solution and only few try to understand the problem first. This has limited the learning process because of the issue is generally addressed by a single angle without having a systemic look. Then is required to come up with new ways of interaction to open spaces to dialogue and to facilitate interactions and trust generation. We try to do so through participatory diagnosis and social cartography, and with that we could approach to a better understanding of the context and the problem. What is the context of our experiment? Well, the context of this experiment is the rural areas of Colombia. We work with two associations of cocoa producers that inhabit areas of difficult access, little or no technical assistance with difficulties to enter the market. We observed that it was a utilitarian relationship between both of them, institutions and producers. The first one nurtured his impact indicators by number of producers benefit with inputs and training, and the latest finding the institutions a source of supplies and information. Although they are highly valued, dominant forms of interaction between policy and communities do not foster network development. This makes that the regime actors are not perceived as a trustworthy. That is the opposite case that with universities, seen as a bridging actor that can find the common points among the different visions. What we have learned from this experimentation, the experimentation as a practice exercise allows everything. It gives us the opportunity to try anything and learn about it in an unlimited way. And that is because we can reflect on both the success and the errors. But for me, the most interesting is when you learn from the mistakes, and it is the most valuable aspect of the practice. I consider that the redefinition should be built on relationship of trust and approach through transdisciplinary initiatives based on practice that work directly with civil society, allowing processes that facilitate knowledge co-construction under conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity, making an experiment truly inclusive. And finally, what are the implications for policy from this redefinition? Well, this implies accepting multiple visions. Is to accept that other mechanisms are needed to build trust, rather than participatory methods that claim to be inclusive. It's about applying methods based on real practice that provides tools and skills to people to analyze their own context. This empowers and gives voice and generates trust and includes multiple visions of the same problem. This will improve significantly not only the politics context, but also their impact. They will mean that by generating a reflection and a co-construction of knowledge together with civil society, the policies will be more adjusted to the real problem, not to the assumption made by professionals who in many cases don't know the context, formulating solutions that don't fit, and it really doesn't manage to solve complex social problems. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So I think some of the issues that we raised at the beginning of the talk that I raised, I think with regards to experimentation, we began to see sort of put more meat on some of those issues. So first of all, I think it's clear that there is an enormous gap or knowledge asymmetry between public policy, which and what's happening on the ground, and that creates sometimes certainly a knowledge gap, but also a problem of trust with regard to the policy making process. I think Anna just said that sometimes the universities and university academics will try to bridge that, and that gives them a certain degree of agency, or the role that the academics play is quite different than sometimes it occurs in the North. It's a much more active role, perhaps much more active participant role in those processes. I think there was also this issue of asymmetry comes up a lot in relation to the real problems and the real issues that people face. How do we actually, the only way in which sometimes that can be expressed is through practice. And I think that creates questions around the limits of upscaling when the context between one place and another are actually quite different. And then of course there's all the issues about coordination and so on. But what I'll do now, therefore, is we can begin with the panelists, bring them in, and start the discussion with them. We're going to start with Bipashi. I think it's I would encourage everyone to please do put your comments down, ask questions, because it would be nice to have lots of discussion and reflection about what people think in their own context, or it doesn't have to be your context necessarily, but some of the issues that are being raised about what really is a very, very important method, which is how we undertake experimentation in this Global South context. So Bipashi, thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. So thank you for inviting me for discussing this really, really interesting topic. And also, it was a real pleasure to listen to all the 3 case studies, the 3 experiments in Latin America, in different parts of Latin America. And I really, really enjoyed listening and thinking about the issues that all of you talked about. And that really gives me a very different perspective of thinking of experimentation, thinking of Global South dynamics. So just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Bipashi. I am a research fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK. I work in the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, and I'm here talking, so as Matthias said in the beginning of this panel, I am not very much aware of of the Latin American context, but most of my work during my PhD, and also at the present, is thinking of transitions, transformation dynamics in the global south. So I do take a real special interest in thinking of how transitions can happen and how is it uniquely different in global south context in contrast to the general dynamics that we see in the Western context, and especially given that the transitions theories stem from case studies and evidence from the global north. So it's really important that we are having this discussion of thinking of what it is that it makes transitions and transformative change so different, and why we need to sort of redefine and rethink transitions and experimentation in the global south context. So that's my sort of entry point to it. And the other entry point is obviously working in the consortium. I have been always interested in trying to compare between the different global south contexts where the TIPSI members work. And so I have been also following work in South Africa alongside other countries in the Africa Hub. And also it's really interesting to see how transformative innovation policy and the implementation of transformative innovation policy and also policy engagement as a method plays out differently in global south context within the consortium as compared to other members in the global north. So I'm really talking from that perspective of a slightly outsider who is not really working within the experimentation in the context, but zooming out and looking at comparing between these contexts and learning from the different contexts that TIPSI is working in. So in terms of commenting on particularly these three experiments, I feel one of the first questions to address really is why transformation or experimentation is indeed more contingent in the global south. So what are the real issues in the global south? I think that's the first point. And I think there is a lot of literature about, there is an increasing amount of scholars who are thinking of what are the different rules, I would say, that define change processes or systemic change processes in the global south. So in one way, we can think of that, and the panelists today did touch upon the real challenges. So you mentioned scarcity of resources. That indeed means that experimentation becomes really risky, that you can't afford to fail. So this appetite for failure is often sometimes becomes challenging when there is scarcity of resources. And then there is also need-based innovation. So in the global south, we see a lot of innovations at a very small scale and at the community levels, in community-driven innovations in rather non-industrialized settings, as opposed to the ones in the global north. And these innovations are much more small-scale and need-based, and that really caters to sort of day-to-day challenges of living. So this is a very different circumstance in the global south, where people are living in uncertainty, people are living day to day, and they have day-to-day struggles and day-to-day challenges to meet. So in that context, I feel there is other issues. When we talk about the regime, for instance, we have to think of how to redefine regime in the first place in the global south. Because regimes in the global north, by definition, we think about stable regimes with very rigid structures. But as many scholars have already shown, there is a need to rethink about how regimes are. So regimes are probably not so entrenched or less rigid. And it provides much more flexibility, much more adaptability and resilience in the global south. So in that context, how do we understand experimentation is really something that we need to think about. Experimentation is really something. So just to sort of go to, given that contingency that we have in the Global South context about regimes, about day-to-day struggles, the real question is then, when we have these experimentation, how these experimentation can really enhance or help us in addressing these challenges that Global South regimes have. So in some way, we can think of experimentation as a way to make the existing challenges much more. So experimentation as a way to address these unique challenges in the Global South, but these contingencies, these challenges also influence how we understand learning, how we understand networking, how we understand institutionalizing, or how we understand providing solutions to problems. So this is what the panelists were talking about. So what I heard from the case studies is that they were really in each of the three countries, in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, the real issues with experimentation was around, okay, how do we actually provide protection to the ongoing activities? How do we shield the alternative practices from the dominant sort of pushback from the regimes, from the pushback of the incumbent actors? And then there was this discussion about, there was a point about networking. So how do we actually enable collaboration? How do we enable collaboration between multiple actors? And there is the theory. So in the methodology within the transformative innovation policy methodology, we talked about the theory of why networking is important for systemic change. So how do we broaden our networks, which means catering to different, or bringing in diverse stakeholders from, because this is systemic change. So how do we actually broaden the networks across, bringing in people from different diverse communities and providing a shared space for shared visioning, for shared anticipation, as opposed to deepening. So there was a discussion about the trust building. So I think in the Global South context, that is a real important, crucial issue. How do we actually develop trust, and what are the sort of methods and tools that can enable building trust? And that means deepening these diverse networks. And I think an important issue that is kind of mentioned, but not explicitly mentioned, is that through networking also enables learning. And learning is really important because you can have, so I think one of you mentioned broadening knowledge bases. So of course there is that's an important issue in the Global South, where a lot of solutions are engineering solutions. So a lot of solutions are technical solutions, technological solutions, and often what is missing is social, kind of socio-technical innovations. So how do we actually combine knowledge from other disciplines, knowledge from other experts, together with engineers, together with technical solutions? That's really something that is important in the Global South. And so that's broadening, but also learning is about reflection. So in the transformative innovation policy, we talk about deep learning. So I think an important aspect of experimentation could be about how to deepen our, how to deepen the learning, how to actually enable space for reflection, space for questioning assumptions, space for rethinking and redefining the ways we do things. And then, so I will jump into the policy aspect of this, because I think really this is why it's really important to redefine experimentation. So I have maybe quickly a few points to think about how to redefine experimentation, because that's the topic of this panel. So I think we need to make experiments in the Global South much more systemic. So how to actually expand technical experimentation in building technologies, building technological solutions into more holistic. So how to actually combine policy experimentation, experimentation with governance, experimentation with other systemic dimensions together with technological experiments. I think that's the main, that's one of the things to redefine. The second thing is that experiments can be about niche protection, but experiments can also be about mainstreaming. So I think we need to think beyond protection of niches, protection of alternatives. So there is, at some point, we need to also redefine experimentation into thinking how to actually make these niches regimes, how to make these niches or alternatives into tomorrow's incumbency or tomorrow's mainstream regime. So I think it's really important that we think of experimenting with opening up of the regime, experimenting with expanding the niches, experimenting with mainstreaming sustainable values and practices. And a third thing about redefining experiments is that how to really understand, how to really learn from mistakes. So I think, again, going back to solutionism that one of you are talking about, I think we need to redefine experimentation around learning versus finding solutions. So understanding the problem, learning from mistakes is something that should guide experimentation alongside finding solutions. And to wrap up, I think I just want to mention one thing. I really liked the idea where in the first presentation you talked about this experimentation or supporting alternative rule of, I think you mentioned biocentric paradigm of alternative agricultural practice. So I really like that idea that maybe as a policy action in the Global South, policy actors can think of supporting alternative rules like biocentric paradigm or focusing on sustainability over profitability. So these are the kind of overarching rules that can be supported, and there can be many experiments for nurturing that rule. So there can be many experiments around biocentric paradigm, and then policy action would be to support biocentric paradigm. So I think that's a really, really interesting way to support experiments in the Global South. And I wouldn't go into the details of intermediation, because that's also a very, very interesting topic. And there's a lot of literature in the transitions literature about the role of different types of intermediaries and intermediary actors, universities being one of them. So I would really request, if you're interested, to read and have debates around the role of intermediaries. I think that's really important. Yeah, so I would stop there, and I look forward to more discussion about this. And we have a network of scholars working on transitions in the Global South. So I would welcome you to join that network if you're interested in exactly this topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pipashi. Some interesting points there. I'd like to now invite Juan Pablo Isasa. Is he here? To no, Amy, it's Juan Pablo, not Pablo. Juan Pablo, are you there? JP, I think Isasa is how he's come under. Do you want to start talking, Juan Pablo? Juan Pablo, are you there? No, I think there may be, Juan Pablo, one more go. I think there may be a connection problem. Okay, let's maybe, while we try to get that sorted. Elisa, can we hear you? Sure. Oh, no, Juan Pablo's back. Juan Pablo's back. Juan Pablo, great. Please, go ahead. Juan Pablo, can you hear me? Please go ahead. We can see you. No. Juan Pablo, no. This is a shame because before when we tried this, it worked. Are you muted, Juan Pablo? ¿Estás silenciado? No, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Maybe we can get Elisa and try to sort out the problems of connection with Juan Pablo for now. Okay. Elisa, go ahead, please.
Okay. Sorry, Juan Pablo. Look forward to hearing what you have to say momentarily. Thank you, Matias. Thank you, Claudia. And also Carmen, Pablo, Ana Milena for the really interesting presentations. Very pleased to be here today and share a few thoughts also on experimentation and learn from everybody else on the panels. Fantastic. Sorry, I keep getting the chat popping up. So, in response to this first question, is experimentation for transformative change more contingent in the global South? I think, certainly the presentations and Bipashi also highlighted really important contingencies to experimentation for transformative change in their respective contexts. And, reflecting on this question in preparation a little bit for today, I couldn't help, of course, think of the context of COVID and this issue of, resources in the context of COVID. And I think, the pandemic has made all contexts more contingent, I think, or it's shown us the vulnerabilities and the contingencies that all our various contexts have been facing, North and South. Existing infrastructures, existing services have all proven to be kind of ill-prepared for the current context. And so many socio-technical systems, particularly, how they attend the needs of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. But certainly existing infrastructures were more capable to adapt in some global North circumstances than others, and take advantage, whether it's vaccine development and distribution, especially importantly, resources were able to be mobilized more quickly and on different scale to ramp up attention to these needs and to address gaps. And here, I just, because this is the world we're living in, I think this, this context where policy experimentation kind of became the rule in addressing this and it still is today, the evolving context of the pandemic, and whether this experimentation is for transformative change or just to address incrementally, the gaps in need is probably still to be determined. But I think it is likely to turn out to be transformative in some contexts. But I think it shows us, coming back to the question, there's maybe an important difference between different national or even within nation subnational contexts, this ability to leverage resources towards experimentation, and at what costs and what trade-offs exist in doing so. Being able to dedicate resources to experiment with developing new forms of service provision in the context of the pandemic versus trying to just provide immediate cash transfers to families that are hungry because they depend on selling, cell phone minutes or empanadas in the street, and they aren't even allowed to go out because the quarantine measures are in place. That this very real context is a very difficult decision to make as a policymaker. And I think that every country has faced these trade-offs and difficult decisions, but certainly in the global South, it's been much more stark. So at the same time, there are resources, and I think there's a little bit of a misrepresentation sometimes, and sometimes the resources are just not well allocated, and has to do with weak and poorly distributed tax regimes and massive inequalities and other challenges that make the resources scarce for experimentation. But I think just wanted to really emphasize this aspect about the scale of resources for experimentation supported by institutions is I think very different. And again, coming up to something that came out, and I think this point of resources is also raised certainly in some of the presentations. I think Pablo raised it, but also, as mentioned, in context of scarcity, people are experimenting all the time. They're improvising to meet basic needs. Pashi emphasized that too. There's high levels of informality, the lack of social safety nets, weak governance institutions. Institutions are not always reliable. Different types of infrastructures, soft and hard infrastructures, aren't guaranteed. So this kind of improvisation is the normal. But when this experimentation is for survival, I guess it raises the question: what are the limits to their potential to their transformative potential? And as this, while it's an opportunity, this being a sort of part of the culture itself could be a strength and an opportunity. I think Pablo points that out. But how can that be better supported from an institutional and longer term perspective? So there was I have lots of different thoughts based on what people have just been saying also, as opposed to what I'd been thinking about before today. But I think, so how this contingency influences learning and the understanding and use of transformative outcomes. I think another big challenge I want to raise here, and is also been touched on in the presentations, is the political cycle. Besides the resources, I think this challenge is true for all contexts, but one very marked where I live in the Colombian context, and maybe Juan Pablo is going to touch on this some from his role, but how electoral cycles and being able to keep experiments going and supported and shielded beyond short term is I think a real challenge. We have the example of the Libro Verde, the Green Book in Colombia. Matias knows closely, is part of, which proposed some very innovative ideas for building a transformative science, technology, innovation policy focused on transformative outcomes explicitly tied to the SDGs. But we have a new president, a new minister, and there's a change of priorities, and the new people who are put in place want to make their own mark. They want to hire new people to work with. So sometimes these the agendas, even when there's good policies in place, I think it was Carmen who also brought that up, the implementations can be lacking, or they can be used in service of political agendas instead of really being focused on building capacities to foster transformative change. Examples here in Colombia, we have my team, we have some projects in coal producing regions in Colombia, and we work on how to support transitions beyond coal in the context of climate change, and how that's going to particularly affect fossil fuel producing regions like here in Colombia and coal, and trying to understand how innovation policy can support these transitions. But when the governor isn't even able to fulfill half their term, and then you have these planning processes getting stifled because there's a new allegation or investigation of corruption charges, or this becomes extremely difficult to build continuity, which is key for shielding networking learning, I think, this uncertainty. And I think also, Carmen also raised this issue of need for long-lasting support by intermediaries. Pablo raised the importance of long-term visions in his presentation. And I think this also connects to the issue of trust that Ana Milena and Carmen also raised, which is perhaps, again, under discussed. I think you can't just, put a bunch of people in a room and expect a transformative result. I think is something that requires a lot of skill in the facilitation and sensitivity and support, and it has to be a longer term process that is built over time. And how do you acknowledge, in these processes, acknowledge different standpoints, different perspectives and visions, as the presentations raised? How do you build capacity, empower those participants to have an informed engagement and only through that, can you build that foundation of trust and that acknowledges these visions and is realistic. And again, coming back to the case of the transitions from coal in these regions, there's a long history of a lot of conflict and distrust amongst many of the interested groups. And so setting people, even people that maybe have a similar vision of wanting to support a transition, may not have the same vision about how to get there. And so how do you get people to sit down and move beyond those differences and actually, develop a productive process is really challenging. And this comes back to something else I wanted to raise. And I think I was thinking about it before Bipashi raised her comments, but I'll put it this way. I think the attention to the political economic context is, I think, another factor that may be different in many global South. At least I'm focused in this context of fossil fuel and extractive production, but so many countries that are dependent on natural resources for export, and their economies are just really heavily dominated by that. In that context, that this is the incumbent interests are extremely challenging, and how do you develop processes to shield innovative experiments or efforts in that context? I think I was thinking of Bipashi because she proposed, you need to rethinking what is a regime in the global South, and that perhaps they're not so stable or entrenched. And I'd flip that maybe and provocatively say, regimes have different stabilities and different entrenchments that could be even more entrenched in some ways than in the global North, but tied to these particular political economic interests that may be, connected to national elites that have a long history, and how these kind of political coalitions and settlements can be very difficult to unsettle because of these influences. So this just presents important challenges, I think, when you're trying to address how to shield and learn. And I think again, in this context, coming back to where I'm working in fossil fuels and just transitions, this is where you see that the role of civil society and workers are actually, workers from the industry are the ones that are pushing for the conversation to happen, and paying attention to how they can bring that conversation forward is really key. I think I'm not sure where I'm at in my time. I didn't pay close attention to when I started. So should I wrap up, or do I have another minute?
If you want a couple of minutes more, but just a couple of minutes, Elisa, it's up to you.
Perfect. I think I just, I think also Bipashi raised something that was really important about this idea of not just thinking of beyond in the redefining experimentation, not just being about these perhaps grassroots niches, but also how do you do experimentation in the mainstream? And I think that's a really important point. And also that it not just be about solutions, but that about learning, because you don't know where the solutions also are going to come from. And I think that is more realistic to the uncertainty that we're all living in now, but is particularly defined in the global South. And I think so. Just to close, I think this is some of the policy implications of this redefinition. I think working on experimentation in the context of policy is obviously necessary, but challenging in this context for the reasons I raised above or before. But this is something that shows the need for institutions that have a life beyond this electoral cycle, that can be shielded, so to speak, from politics, even though all institutions are shaped and have politics present. But trying to, really support multi-actor platforms that can buffer and guide and support policy, but that also have teeth and are resourced, that can make some things happen. I think this is really important for creating continuity and direction. I think this is something that Pablo pointed to, this role of policy in an in articulation between actors, and especially in the context of scarce resources. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the rest of the conversation and Juan Pablo's comments. Thank you.
Okay, Alyssa, thank you very, very much. I mean, you've been at the coalface, so to speak, with lots of experiences there, and it's actually very interesting. I mean, the way that when we deal with experimentation, we have to look at the definition of the regime. Where is it malleable, but where is it entrenched? And it's sometimes very difficult to do that. And lots of other issues there. So let's hope, Juan Pablo, can we hear you now? Thank you very much, Elisa. Juan Pablo?
I hope that you can. Can you hear me okay? I'm listening.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna go on and on, so hopefully I'm not gonna lose the connection. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you what's going on here at the Coffee Axis region in Colombia. Basically, the ensemble that we are now working on, it's called the Administrative and Planning Region, Región Administrativa de Planificación de El Eje Cafetero, it belongs to the Axis region, and it composes 4 departments, states, if you were in the US, Caldas, Risaralda, Quindío, and Tolima. And basically, the reason for this ensemble is because one of the main issues going on in Colombia has been always the decentralization difficulties that the country poses in terms of how we depend so much in Bogota and how much the state is centralized. And in that regard, it's interesting because I think when we see at the transformative outcomes and we see how all the tools that we have access to right now from the theory, especially mostly shielding, learning, and networking, we see that all these practices are going to be able and have been able to be used in a fantastic way, and hopefully transformative innovation policy will deepen at the national level, but I think at the departmental level and the local level. So one of the things that goes on here in this region is that mostly when we look at the productive chains and clusters within the region, one of the main difficulties that we always have is associations and how small farmers and groups of farmers get together and actually pose the challenge, and they confront the challenge of being associated one another, because unfortunately people may not know this from our country, but we are very individualistic. We are a very individualistic culture. People are very for some reason, communities, have difficulty working together, and that always poses a challenge. So in that sense, and just going in depth on the discussion that we're having right now, I believe that experimentation for transformative change is actually contingent here. Considering this region as global south, because most of the practices that we've seen in other contexts, like the ones that have been presented here, always revolve around the fact that networking is not I guess in a way respected as it should be. Speaking specifically about how you can broaden and deepen the social networks that revolve around the niches. And all those conditions that are needed to strengthen the niches are always a challenge. I think that mostly because of what we saw from Carmen and how she explained very thoroughly, the tensions with stakeholders, always that are shielding the project or projects in general, and that's also common here at the local level in the coffee regions. This means that because regions are communities are very individualistic, that means that there's also a distrust from outsiders, and we also, like in Mexico, we also have differences in land tenure practices. We've been having a discussion in this country for the past 80 years about how to reform agriculture and how to actually make it more accessible to more ensembles where there are productive chains and there are clusters that are important and that actually can fall into an internationalization scheme. So obviously, this paradox of individualism versus productivism also affects the way things are promoted and the way policies are promoted at the local level. I believe, in my personal theory and hypothesis, that Colombian regions have had a lot of difficulty transforming from a mixed economy, an ECLAC economy, which ruled obviously Colombia until the early 1990s, and how we began transforming into a market economy. That paradigm shift that also obviously mainly affects the way are exposed to the international economic system, has brought upon the huge challenge of having a trade capacity building program in national level, which obviously it's called by Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, and maybe Bucaramanga and Barranquilla. But when you go to isolated regions, the paradigm, the economic paradigm, and the economic system that rules the land is still very much towards agriculture and maybe some manufacturing. But there is not much. There's not a huge tendency to go into a market economy, and which based upon a knowledge-based economy, and the fact that we don't have services in the GDP or the GNP as a real factor which impacts the local economies is huge. It's a huge flaw, or it's a huge challenge, if you call it that way. So you see this transition from communities, and you see the way that concerning how you can become active towards shielding. That transition between community and the intermediary multi-actors and the regime, obviously, it reframes these communities from obviously trying to have a more smooth decision making process, because obviously there is a tension, there is a constant tension. And I think it's because since there's a very high individualistic still tendency of these communities to not work as associations, these remain huge challenges. So I guess in a way I'm responding on how these transformative outcomes and how this niche building, which covers shielding, learning, and networking, have all the difficulties of a mixed economy, and the way we haven't been able to interact with the international world. And I think it's also another symptom is that we have signed several trade agreements with different countries in the world, with different regions, and what usually goes on is that the other countries take good use and make good use of the agreements, but Colombia always in the regions that, for example, that I'm working at right now, have very low levels and percentages of participation within these trade agreements. And I think it's because of the networking principles, but also sometimes I think it poses it's evident in the learning process, because when you're building a niche that obviously wants to have this continuing process of learning and actually building that capacity. The huge challenge is policy making and the way policies are, and I think obviously Elisa was mentioning this factor. Local policies and public policies are always in conflict with one another in terms of like the departmental level or the municipal level, and that's one difficulty that has been it's been present for the past 20 to 25 years. So you have a national policy, you have a departmental policy, and then you have municipal policies that are in conflict with each other. And that's how I think, for example, experimentation should be redefined, and maybe the policy implications of the redefinition of how experimentation could be redefined. It's one that could be tackled in order to have it as a policy making tool. So I think that the methodology it has a lot of potential here in the coffee axis region, but obviously we have to always take into account the way that these relations and the instability of how all the interactions between communities and between other types of factors are handled and are tailored towards the region that we're at. So I think it's very important that we actually use these tools that we have right now, and I think that it's a great opportunity for us to actually begin thinking about using transformative outcomes as a tool for our regions. So those are basically my inputs.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I think you talked about a lot of the challenges of the regions in which you're trying to develop policy, which feel perhaps marginalized compared to the big urban centers in Colombia. I think it's one of the big issues that you're facing. And there's different ways of addressing that. One is internationalization, to link up with these sort of actors, which could be around value chains, but also perhaps within policy, within the way policy is seen, that regions, that policy is focused more on the people and their problems and how that's developing. And I hope that we can work further on that in Colombia with you and with the actors that you face.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Could I perhaps now, we've got just a little bit of time, maybe sort of 6 or 7 minutes to address one or two questions. Pablo, are you there? Pablo, are you there? Great. So Andrew's got a question here about this issue of the degree to which it is possible to establish coalitions of niche actors to generate transformative development dynamics. I know you've got, one of the things that you did when you began the work in Maule was that you got in contact with a whole series of, I don't know if they're niches or actors who are doing experiments, and you began to sort of talk to them. So do you find that they were in contact already? How perhaps could you foment a more institutionalization of these networks so that they can really turn into proper niches?
Yeah, thanks, Matias, for the question, and Andrew. So yeah, this is a very interesting topic. When we began our work, yeah, that's true. We didn't find like a proper niche. There is some kind of there are many actors distributed around the territory. We can't see a real network of actors. Also, it's some kind of actors pursuing their own objectives. They have different projects, and they're experimenting on a very small level. So one of the challenges here, for us at least, was to establish some kind of first getting to know these people, and we found that they were talking about very similar things, but the surprise was that they weren't seeing the same thing. They thought that they were kind of focusing on the differences. So of course the differences are very relevant, because they are maybe talking about different things, different point of views about, in this case, agriculture. So we think we need to keep those differences, to kind of let them know that they need to have some level of they need to own their own projects but we were trying to put them together in something bigger, to see this bigger picture. So about these kind of coalitions, I think there's not already some kind of coalition at the niche level. We can't really talk about a niche, but in this case, I think one of our main ideas at this point, one learning we have found, is that the role of the policy in this case need to be to establish this kind of connection between these different actors, to put them together in the same level and let them know each other. They don't really know each other, so there's a big potential for public policy to start talking about these potential challenges, these changes that everyone the society is seeing, that it is very relevant to tackle these challenges. But there are solutions, and at the small level you see solutions, but public policy needs to play a role to connect these solutions. So
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, I think that's very useful. There's all people doing, but it's all atomized, and public policy, that would require public policy to hand over a bit of power or a bit of influence to these actors, to let them do it rather than they themselves do it in a top-down way. So that requires quite a big change, wouldn't it, in terms of how public policy is perhaps used to working. Gunman, can I invite you to come in? I know you wanted to make one or two comments with regard to Andrew's points as well. We have very little time now, so I'd appreciate if you can be brief.
Well, I think the comments are very, 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 very good. I mean, what we have seen in this experiment is that it's very, very, very young, but there is at the niche level other projects in social enterprises that are inspiring. We cannot say there is a coalition, but because the niche has to mature. I think coalition comes when you are in the moment that that you break the regime rules, and none of these experiments can be in that moment. Okay, but I think something important is that we should look at alternative rules, as Vipashi mentioned. Decolonized public policy. I think it's very important, okay? Because if you do not really make horizontal relations, as Ivan Escoto mentions here, you cannot make a change. There will be such a gap between regime and niche and experiments that is almost impossible that you come to make a good embeddedness of the experiment so that they can mature in some way. But they are still, I think, the three that have been mentioned, not in a moment of maturity to collide, to make a strong niche and change the regime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope we have more time to discuss.
Of course, it's always a limitation. Just before I bring Claudia in, I think Diego asked an interesting questions about who these intermediary actors sometimes are, and he mentioned their universities. So academics have, I think, quite a different role in Latin America, and have traditionally had quite a different role than is the case perhaps in Europe. They are much more, I would say, action actors. So they get very much their hands dirty in terms of the actual projects, in terms of the social movements, and that creates a responsibility, I think, in terms of how that happens. And also, of course, that means that the views of the academics, their personal views and their inclinations become a factor when working on transitions. Other actors, I think, is, for example, the church. I mean, the Iberoamericano is a Jesuit university, and often actors like the church play big roles as intermediaries, and they are because they are respected, sometimes more than the policymakers. So these are all things, these are all realities that one has to work with, and take into account the way that works. It's that's why I think methodologies such as experimentation are very, very important that we can introduce into this, that can actually sort of organize the learning process. And I don't think we've yet quite dealt with the issue of how in an experiment you dealing with the day-to-day problems, but also creating a new future, which is what transformation is about. I think that's going to be an ongoing debate that we need to really work on within those of us who are interested in transformations in the global south. But I want to bring in Claudia now, who has been heavily involved in the Latin America Hub from the beginning. She has worked with all the experiments, 9 or 10 experiments, and maybe she can just give her not an easy task, an overall view of the discussion so far and this question of experimentation in the global south.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, and thank you to everyone for their insights and experiences. I think I can make just 3 main points. One is about the meaning of contingency in the global south and in experimentation. So, and it is expressed in informal practices, utilitarian relationships, and predictable implementation of regulations and less institutionalized processes. And we heard here about community-driven innovation, needed-based solutions, day-to-day situations, and all this create a limitation for identify desirable futures, and it has an effect on how alignment is achieved, for example. But it also makes more prompt the actors to design and undertake solutions on their own without relying, for example, on policy. So it makes initiative more scattered, but it poses challenges into policy, because it has to be able, the policy has to be able to articulate, create platforms to bring in together different actors, different initiatives, and so on. So yes, and it has been aggravated by the pandemic, as Elisa pointed. So that's one point. The other point is about learning in this context, and therefore learning here is key to achieve common understandings around the situated problems and possible solutions, what could be the possible solutions, and also learning, taking from the experience of the experiments and the groups, has facilitated the creation of binding narratives that help build trust and foster alignment, but also legitimize decision-making, which is crucial here. But it also, for example, helps, for example, overcome utilitarian relationships, as Anna presented in her case. So there is a call to create and to broaden networks, to combine different knowledge bases and different experiences and skills. And finally, the final point is about policy. And policy has an important role to design instruments that go beyond projects and that can provide a broader support to these experiments. So this was explained, for example, by Vipashi in supporting experiments more broadly, more holistic experiments in different domains. Also in understanding understanding the regime, and of course supporting and creating continuity in how to provide shielding, nurturing, and scaling up solutions for transformation. So that's all I will say. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia, again for your help, and I hope that we'll continue with this discussion. It's crucial, it's very important, despite all the problems that everybody has talked about, and there are, because it's a much more complex environment. I think we've been making important strides within the hub in the work that we've done. There have been some real developments. There's been a lot of learning that's taken place, and we have a website, which Twitter feeds and so on, where you can follow all the events that are taking place. So hopefully you'll keep in touch, and thank you very much for coming to this session. Thanks a lot.